They said it would be only for a season, a year, a paycheck, and then back to town. But the season stayed. The town did not. At 6,000 feet, in a basin hemmed by dark timber, snow that can hang 8-9 months of the year, people kept coming, or they stayed. This place looks like a photograph left in the sun. Cabins, tables with forks still in their drawers, chairs tipped as if someone stepped outside and forgot to come back. You can stand in the main trough and feel the distance. Not just miles, years. Obsession. Promises. Why would anyone refuse to leave? Why would a man leave his furniture rather than haul it to the valley below? There are stories here, hard ones, of mills dragged up steep trails, of men who staked claims and built their lives around a single vein of quartz, of a fire that ate a main street in an October night. And yet the town waits. This is Garnet, Montana. No one locked the doors. They walked away as if they would return. They never did. Before there was a town here, before the saloons, the schoolhouse, the laughter echoing off frozen timber, there was only movement, seasonal, quiet, respectful. For thousands of years, these mountains were not owned. They were passed through. Hunting parties moved between valleys, following elk, following seasons, never staying long enough to scar the land. The Salish, the Kootenai, the Pont d'Oreille. They knew these ridges well, but not as a place to build. This basin, high in the Garnet Range, was too harsh for permanent life. Winter came early here, and stayed late. Snow layered the ground most of the year. Food was scarce. Travel was slow, so they passed through and left it untouched. Even when outsiders first arrived, they didn't stop either. In 1806, the expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark moved along the nearby Blackfoot River corridor. They mapped the valleys, tracked the rivers, but they didn't build here. Not yet. Decades later, fur trappers followed. Men from the Hudson's Bay Company, the American Fur Company. They came for beaver pelts, soft gold before real gold arrived. They cut through these mountains in the 1830s, using the same indigenous travel corridors. Temporary camps, then gone. This place, even then, resisted permanence. It wasn't until the 1850s that the first whisper of something deeper surfaced. In 1852, a French-Canadian trapper named Francois Finlay found gold at nearby Gold Creek. It was the first documented gold discovery in what would become Montana. A spark, then roads followed. The Mullen Road cut through the wider region in 1860, linking Fort Benton to Walla Walla. Freight wagons creaked across distances that had once taken months to cross. By 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad reached Gold Creek, steel rails where only hoofprints had been. The world was getting closer, but not Garnet. Even with roads, even with rail, this basin remained isolated. 20 miles east of Missoula, 100 miles west of Butte. But distance here wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in elevation, in switchbacks, in snowpack. Supplies had to be hauled by wagon up brutal grades. In winter, wagons couldn't climb at all. Only pack animals, skis, sleds. Sometimes nothing moved for weeks, which made what happened next even more unlikely. Because despite all this, men started looking up into these ridges and seeing something else. Not isolation. Opportunity. The first placer miners began working nearby creeks in the 1860s. Especially Bear Creek, just a few miles away. They panned gravel, sluiced runoff after spring thaw, washed sediment for flecks of color. It was seasonal work. Rough camps formed, Beartown, Bearmouth, canvas tents, timber shacks, men chasing rumors. But placer gold always tells the same story. Gold in streams means gold somewhere above. And so prospectors began climbing higher, into the basin, into the snow, into what would become Garnet. They were following veins, not yet visible, but inevitable. And one man, working almost alone, would find the quartz source that changed everything. But that discovery, and the town it would create, didn't happen overnight. The men in the creeks were never meant to stay. Placer mining is impatient work. You sift, you wash. You hope the river remembers where it buried its secrets. But rivers don't make men rich for long. They tease. They scatter. They leave just enough gold behind to keep you freezing in the water another season. So the smarter miners looked uphill. Because gold in a stream means one thing. It came from somewhere. Higher, locked in stone. In the early 1870s, one prospector kept climbing into the headwaters above First Chance Creek. Not a crowd, not a rush. Just one man, stubborn enough to keep looking where others saw nothing but timber and snow. Samuel Thurk Ritchie. He wasn't backed by investors. No crews. No machinery. Just tools. A mule team. And the kind of patience that borders on obsession. Around 1873, maybe 74, he found it. A quartz vein, bright with gold. He named the claim Nancy Hanks, after Abraham Lincoln's mother. It sounded almost poetic, but there was nothing poetic about the work that followed. Hard rock mining is not the romance people imagine. You don't scoop gold from water. You break mountains. Ritchie worked the vein alone for years, dragging ore out by hand, crushing it using an arrastra, a primitive mill where mule-pulled stones ground rock into powder. Slow, brutal, relentless. Every ounce of gold cost muscle, time, and winter spent nearly alone in the basin. Word spread slowly. Not a stampede, not yet, because even with gold confirmed, Garnet was still a logistical nightmare. No proper roads, no cheap explosives, no stamp mills powerful enough to process large volumes of ore. Claims were staked through the 1870s and 1880s, but development crawled. Men came, looked, and many left again. The gold was real, but so were the costs. Then the outside world intervened. In 1893, the U.S. government repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Silver prices collapsed almost overnight. Across Montana, silver mines shut down. Thousands of miners, suddenly unemployed, were left with tools, experience, and nowhere to use them. They started looking for gold, and news of the Garnet lodes reached them fast. Within weeks, men began pouring into the Garnet Range. Not dreamers, professionals, hard rock miners who knew exactly what quartz veins meant. Investment followed desperation. In 1895, a Missoula, dentist-turned-prospector, Dr. Armistead Mitchell, financed construction of a 10-stamp mill on First Chance Creek. It was the first real industrial operation in the basin, and getting it there was an ordeal in itself. Heavy machinery had to be hauled up steep mountain trails by mule teams. Piece by piece, it took more than a year. Men dragged boilers, iron stamp heads, lumber, gears, upgrades where even empty wagons struggled. When the mill finally roared to life, everything changed. Because now Garnet's ore could be crushed in volume. Now investors believed the gold could last. Now miners stopped thinking seasonally and started building lives. Cabins appeared first, then bunkhouses, then businesses. The camp that formed around Mitchell's mill was crude, unplanned, temporary. They called it Mitchell at first, a mining camp like dozens of others, but camps become towns the moment people stop planning to leave. And that shift, it didn't happen because of how much gold was in the mountain. It happened because of what people believed was in it. They believed the veins would last forever. They believed the mills would keep crushing. They believed they had finally found a place worth staying for. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. By the time they renamed the camp, it was already too big to think of as temporary. They called it Garnet, after the deep red gemstones scattered through the surrounding rock. A prettier name than Mitchell. More permanent, more hopeful. Hope has a way of making rough places feel like home. By 1898, the basin was no longer quiet. Nearly 1,000 people lived here. Not passing through. Living. You have to picture the scale. Cabins climbing the slopes above First Chance Gulch. Boardwalks hammered over mud and runoff. Timber buildings wedged wherever someone could claim land. There was no town plan. No survey lines. If you owned a mining claim, you built on it. Some buildings stood on log stilts. Some straddled claim borders. Some leaned into each other for support. A town assembled by urgency, not design. And yet it functioned. At its height, Garnet had everything a frontier town needed to convince itself it was permanent. 4 general stores, 4 hotels, 3 livery stables, 2 barber shops, a butcher, a candy store, a dentist's office, a doctor's office, an assay office, 13 saloons, 13, for a population that barely touched 1,000. You could walk the main street at night and hear music leaking through plank walls, glasses striking wood, boots stomping sawdust floors. Places like the Doll Saloon, Oles, glowed in lamplight. Kelly's saloon drew gamblers, dealers, men spending wages before the ink dried on their pay. But Garnet wasn't just vice and velocity. That's what makes it different, because families came too, which meant the town changed. Children's voices echoed where dynamite once did. By 1898, the school had 41 students, a full classroom in a place that barely had foundations under its buildings. Women ran boarding houses, cooked for miners, did laundry, kept books for stores. Some worked counters, some managed businesses outright. Weekends looked different than you'd expect. Saturday night dances filled the miners' union hall, fiddles, boots sliding across plank floors. Church services happened wherever space allowed, sometimes indoors, sometimes outside. Quilting bees, community dinners. Not the chaos of a boomtown, but the rhythm of a settlement trying to civilize itself before the gold ran out. And there were names. Families whose roots dug into the basin as deeply as the mine shafts. The Wells family built the grandest hotel in town, 3 stories tall by 1900, boarding for wealthy visitors, investors, engineers. The Dahl family ran the saloon and boarding house. The Hannafins, the Davies, the Liberties, the Crawfords. One merchant, Frank A. Davy, arrived in 1897 and built a business that would outlast almost everyone else. Storekeeper, saloon operator, stagecoach contractor. He didn't just work in Garnet, he anchored himself to it. Miners who couldn't afford hotel rooms rented attic bunks for $1 a night. Unheated, cramped, but it was shelter. Life here wasn't easy, even in prosperity. Men worked long underground shifts, or had to be blasted, hauled, crushed, processed. Everything required labor. Everything required fuel. And winter was always waiting just beyond the next ridge. Still, crime was strangely rare. There was a jail, a small one, but it almost never filled. One arrest was recorded when a man shot a dog. That was the level of lawlessness. Order wasn't enforced by guns. It was enforced by proximity. You depended on your neighbors too much to make enemies. For a few brief years, Garnet felt stable. Not rich, but sustainable. Children grew up here. Stores stocked shelves. Dances filled halls. And the mines, as stilts, produced gold. But even during the laughter, even during the peak, something quieter was happening underground. The richest ore, the easy ore, was already disappearing, and the town built on top of it didn't notice yet. Boomtowns aren't supposed to have lullabies. They're supposed to be loud, temporary, reckless, men chasing money, then leaving when it runs dry. But Garnet complicated that story, because people brought their families here, not just wives, children, which meant the town had to soften, at least a little. Morning in Garnet didn't begin in saloons. It began in kitchens, wood stoves cracking to life before sunrise, coffee boiling, bread dough rising near heat that never quite reached the corners of the room. Women carried much of the town's invisible labor, cooking for boarders, washing clothes stiff with mine dust, keeping accounts for stores when husbands worked claims. Some ran businesses outright, boarding houses especially. A good boarding house could feed 20 miners a day. 3 meals, every day. No excuses, even when supply wagons were late. Children threaded through all of it. They hauled water, stacked firewood, helped in shops, and when they weren't working, they were being children in one of the most unlikely places imaginable. By 1898, Garnet's schoolhouse held 41 students. One room, mixed ages, slates, chalk, boots lined by the door to keep snow from soaking the floorboards. Teachers came and went, drawn by pay but tested by isolation. One early teacher, Mrs. Pearl Woods, taught here in the early 1900s. She wasn't just teaching arithmetic, she was teaching stability in a town that didn't promise any. Kids walked to school through snow that could reach their knees. Sometimes deeper. Some skied. Others trudged in groups, older siblings, pulling younger ones along narrow paths cut through drifts. Winter didn't cancel class. It just made getting there part of the lesson. Inside homes, life tried to feel ordinary. Families decorated cabins, hung curtains, displayed china they'd hauled up impossible trails. Meals were shared. Birthdays remembered. There were cousins, friends, rivalries. Mary Jane Moran, born later, in 1917, would recall growing up surrounded by relatives in Garnet. Her father ran the town mercantile. and mind on the side. Like many here, survival meant wearing more than one role. Children played in store aisles, behind counters, around supply crates stamped from Missoula. They learned early that everything in town had traveled miles to get there. Nothing was disposable, nothing replaceable. And yet, despite the domestic rhythms, Garnet never let anyone forget where they were. The mountains pressed close, timber blocked horizons, and winter dictated everything. Mines shut down by late fall. Families stockpiled food, game was hunted and preserved. Cabins were poorly insulated. Some miners, saving fuel, slept in unheated attic bunks even in freezing months. Pneumonia, measles, sickness in general could turn deadly fast, because reaching Missoula in winter could take days, if travel was possible at all. Isolation wasn't just emotional, it was medical, seasonal, total. Still, people adapted. Saturday nights meant dances, Union Hall floors vibrating under fiddle music, boots striking rhythm to forget the cold outside, church gatherings, community meals, quilting bees where stories passed between stitches. It wasn't luxury, but it was life, real life, not the caricature of a mining camp. And that normalcy, that fragile sense of permanence, made what came next hurt more, because towns built only on gold expect collapse, but towns built on families, they expect to last. Garnet believed it had become the second kind. It hadn't, and the first signs weren't fire or abandonment. They were quieter. The mines were slowing, and the town that depended on them was about to feel it. If gold built Garnet, winter tested it every year without mercy. At 6,000 feet, seasons didn't rotate, they dominated. Snow could fall early, linger late, and settle in for 8, sometimes 9 months. Not light snow. Weight, drifts that swallowed fences, buried wagons, sealed doors shut from the outside. The single road into town, rough even in summer, became useless. Supply wagons stopped. Freight halted miles away. What Garnet had was what Garnet lived on. After the mines slowed in late fall, the town shifted into survival mode. Game was hunted. Wood was cut in relentless cycles. Food stored in cellars carved from frozen ground. Children still went to school, wrapped in layers, faces stung raw by wind. Some skied the distance. Others trudged in silence through timber corridors packed down by repeated footsteps. Inside buildings, heat was never guaranteed. Cabins leaked cold through log seams. Fuel was expensive, and hauling it uphill was brutal. So some miners rented attic bunks, cheaper, unheated, barely insulated. They slept under heavy blankets, breath freezing in the air above them. Sickness traveled fast in those conditions. Pneumonia, measles, winter fevers, and help was far away. If someone fell gravely ill, reaching Missoula could take days, assuming travel was even possible. Storms could isolate Garnet completely, weeks at a time. No mail, no medicine, no visitors, just the same cabins, the same faces, the same frozen silence pressing in from the tree line. Isolation reshaped behavior. People relied on each other more. Shared food, shared fuel, shared labor, but it also trapped them. Leaving in winter wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous, which meant even families considering departure often stayed until spring. And sometimes, spring brought reasons to stay longer. The isolation had another effect too, one no one noticed at the time. It preserved the town, because Garnet was so remote, so snowbound. Outsiders rarely came through the basin. There was nothing to steal yet. No abandoned wealth to plunder. Buildings stood undisturbed. Supplies sat where they'd been left. Time slowed here, not because people wanted it to, but because distance enforced it. And then came the fire, October 4th, 1912. Not winter, not snowbound, just a dry night in a town built almost entirely of timber. The fire started in a saloon. No one ever proved which one. But once flames caught plank walls, there was no stopping it. Wind carried sparks roof to roof. Boardwalks burned like fuse lines. Saloons, stores, hotels. Main Street became a corridor of flame. Contemporary reports said the camp was almost wiped out. Nearly every commercial building burned. By morning, only one store, one small hotel, and one saloon remained standing. Everything else gone. No recorded deaths. which almost made it stranger. A town could survive losing people, but losing its infrastructure, its commerce, its identity, that kind of damage lingers. Some buildings were rebuilt. Simpler, cheaper, temporary, but the fire changed psychology. Investors hesitated. Merchants questioned rebuilding fully, and by then, the mines were already declining. So Garnet entered a new phase. Still standing, still inhabited, but weakened. Winter pressed harder. Isolation felt heavier. And the question no one wanted to say out loud began circulating quietly. If the gold was fading, and the town could burn this easily, why were they still here? The answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't rational either. Part 6. The slow realization. The fire didn't kill Garnet, not immediately. Towns built on gold don't collapse overnight. They fade, in ledgers first, ORI reports, shipment weights, profit margins scribbled in assay offices, and the numbers coming out of Garnet's mines were changing. By the early 1900s, miners had already pulled the easiest wealth from the mountain. The oxidized ore near the surface, rich, accessible, was largely gone. What remained lay deeper, harder rock, lower-grade gold, more expensive to extract, which meant every ounce required more timbering, more blasting, more labor, and profit shrank with every foot tunneled. The Nancy Hanks mine, once the district's pride, and had already yielded hundreds of thousands of dollars in gold by 1907, fortune for its time. But veins thin out, they fracture, they disappear into unworkable seams. By 1905, most of Garnet's major mines were either slowing drastically or closing outright. Investors who once financed expansion began leasing claims instead, letting smaller crews gamble on what remained. It was a quiet retreat of capital. No announcements, no ceremony, just fewer shipments leaving the basin, fewer wages circulating in town. Population followed production. By 1898, Garnet had approached 1,000 residents. By 1900, it had already fallen to roughly 300. 5 years later, closer to 150. Boarding houses emptied first, then hotel rooms. Store shelves stocked less inventory because fewer customers could afford it. Saloons stayed open longest, they always do, but even they felt the contraction. Fewer miners meant fewer paydays. Fewer paydays meant quieter nights. You could still walk the boardwalks, but footsteps echoed differently. The railroad at Gold Creek, once a lifeline, now worked against Garnet. Shipping ore from other, richer districts was cheaper, faster. Investors looked elsewhere. Garnet wasn't exhausted yet, but it was no longer competitive, and the town felt it. Families began leaving in stages, not dramatic departures. Gradual, a boarding house closed. A mercantile sold off excess stock. A cabin went dark for the winter and stayed dark in spring. The school lost students. Desks emptied one by one until maintaining a teacher made no financial sense. Eventually, the school closed. The post office held on longer, a symbolic tether to the outside world. But even mail volume dwindled. In 1928, it shut down too. By then, Garnet was already more memory than municipality. The 1912 fire had gutted its business core. The mines had gutted its economy. And yet, people remained. Not many, but some. Old miners reworking abandoned claims. Storekeepers selling to whoever still passed through. Families unwilling or unable to leave. By 1930, Garnet was effectively a ghost town. Only a handful of residents still called it home. One of them was Frank A. Davey, merchant, saloon operator, a man who had built his entire adult life inside this basin. He stayed so long that when he filed federal paperwork, there were no neighbors left to witness his signature. According to an IRS memo, he had to sign it in front of a mirror. A bureaucratic solution to total isolation. Still, even then, Garnet wasn't finished surprising people. Because just when the town seemed ready to vanish completely, gold did something unexpected. It rose in value again, and for a brief moment, the dead town breathed. By the 1930s, Garnet should have been empty. The mines were quiet. Businesses shuttered, families gone, boardwalks sagged under weather instead of footsteps. It should have ended there. But abandonment isn't always immediate. Sometimes it stalls, because leaving isn't just economic, it's emotional. For many who stayed, Garnet wasn't a workplace anymore. It was identity. Frontier life reshapes people. You learn to cut your own wood, hunt your own food, fix your own roof in sub-zero wind. After that, towns like Missoula feel foreign. Crowded, soft, expensive. So even when mining profits collapsed, some families stayed out of stubborn self-sufficiency. They planted gardens, fished local streams, hunted elk in surrounding timber, living lean, but living free. Others stayed because they believed the gold might come back. And briefly, it did. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt doubled the official price of gold, from 16 an ounce to $32. That single policy decision echoed all the way into the Garnet Range. Old claims suddenly looked viable again. Abandoned ore dumps, once considered worthless, were reworked. Dozens of miners returned. Not a full boom, but a flicker. Cabins that had sat empty for years reopened. Smoke rose from chimneys again. Tools came back out of storage. Even Frank Davy reopened his store and saloon, serving miners the way he had decades earlier. For a moment, Garnet felt alive. Not young, but breathing. Men scraped low-grade ore, reprocessed tailings, searched for overlooked veins. It wasn't wealth they were chasing anymore. It was survival. But the revival never had real momentum. The richest ore was still gone, and what remained required industrial investment that Garnet no longer attracted. Then history intervened again. World War II. In 1942, the U.S. War Production Board banned the use of dynamite for non-essential mining. Explosives were redirected to the war effort. Without dynamite, hard rock mining stops immediately. Operations across Montana shut down, including Garnet's last active claims. This time, there was no second chance. The miners who had returned packed up again. Cabins went dark permanently now, but even then, some emotional gravity kept pulling people back seasonally. Relatives visited in summers, worked small claims, hunted, fished, maintained family cabins. Daniel Kaur, whose family roots tied back to Garnet, would later recall how relatives returned, yearly gardening and working the land long after the town had functionally died. Not because it was profitable, because it was home. Some simply refused to imagine dying anywhere else. One resident reportedly said they would not die in Missoula. They would die in Garnet. And a few almost did. Furniture stayed in cabins because hauling it out was too difficult. China remained in cupboards. Clothes hung in closets, not abandoned in panic, left behind in quiet postponement. As if owners believed they might return next season. Some did. Most didn't. By the mid-1940s, only the oldest holdouts remained. And when they finally left, they didn't slam doors. They closed them gently, because even then, part of them expected Garnet to wait. By the 1940s, Garnet didn't end. It thinned, like breath in cold air. There was no final shift whistle. No announcement. No mass departure down the mountain road. Just fewer lights, each season. After World War II, the basin felt hollow. Mining had stopped completely after the dynamite ban. No investors returned when the war ended. There was nothing left worth financing. The cabins that reopened during the 1934 gold revival closed again, this time for good. Families that had held on through depression and isolation finally accepted it. The town wasn't sleeping. It was over. By 1940, Garnet was already functionally empty. But one figure remained, almost like a caretaker history forgot to dismiss. Frank A. Davy. He had arrived in 1897, ran the store, the saloon, freight contracts, watched the boom rise and collapse around him. And when everyone else left, he stayed. Not because business thrived, because it didn't, but because Garnet was the only place he knew how to live. He operated out of the old assay office building, sold supplies to the occasional hunter, prospector, wanderer who still passed through the basin. A flicker of commerce in a dead town. Other buildings stood silent around him, half-furnished. Dust settling on counters where customers once leaned. Curtains still hanging in hotel windows. It must have felt like living inside memory. Then November 8th, 1947, Frank Davy died. And with him, Garnet lost its last permanent resident. The following year, his estate organized an auction. Word spread fast. Hundreds of bidders climbed into the mountains. Not for property, for pieces of a vanished town. Furniture, tools, bar fixtures, store inventory. They bought what they could. But when the auction ended, something darker followed. Looters arrived, souvenir hunters, people who saw abandonment not as history, but opportunity. They tore through buildings, ripped out doors, peeled wallpaper, stole china, stripped fixtures. The Wells Hotel, once the grandest structure in town, had its staircase removed, as if someone wanted proof they'd been there. It was the only moment Garnet was truly violated, not by fire, not by collapse, but by curiosity without respect. After that wave passed, silence settled fully. The Dahl family, longtime saloon operators, left in 1948. Billy Liberty, another saloon keeper, gone by 1950. No teachers, no merchants, no miners. By mid-century, Garnet had no human heartbeat left, only wind through broken eaves. Wildlife moved where boardwalk crowds once did. Deer in the streets, elk in the timber above cabins. Buildings remained standing, as if their owners had stepped out for supplies and never came back. The end hadn't been explosive. No dramatic collapse. Just one death, one auction, one last wagon leaving the basin. And then, nothing. Silence preserved what people couldn't. After the auction, after the looting, after the last wagon rolled down the mountain, Garnet should have rotted into the forest. Most mining towns did. Timber collapses, roofs cave, snow finishes what abandonment begins, but Garnet had two unlikely protectors: isolation and indifference. The same remoteness that once made life difficult now made decay slow. Few roads, long winters, deep snow sealing the basin half the year, outsiders rarely visited. There was nothing commercial to salvage anymore. So the town sat, cabins still furnished, stores still shelved, personal belongings untouched where looters hadn't reached. Time didn't stop, but it moved differently here. By the late 1960s, historians and land managers began to realize what had survived. Not ruins, a preserved mining town, one of the most intact anywhere in the American West. In 1970, federal land officials designated Garnet worth protecting as a historic site. Stabilization began quietly. Roofs patched, walls braced, logs replaced only when absolutely necessary, always matching original construction. The goal wasn't restoration. It was arresting decay, keeping the town frozen in its final state, not rebuilding it into something artificial. Volunteers joined the effort. Local historians, preservation groups. They cleared brush, repaired boardwalks, secured structures from vandalism. In the 1980s, preservation accelerated. Land ownership had been fragmented. Parcels held by private claim holders. Long after mining ended, through a complex series of acquisitions and land exchanges, key tracts were consolidated under public ownership, roughly 134 acres. The entire historic core came under federal management. What remained inside that boundary was extraordinary. Dozens of buildings, saloons, cabins, hotels, stores, outbuildings, more than 80 historic structures identified as contributing to the district's significance. Far more than most ghost towns ever retain. Many still held artifacts inside: furniture, cookware, tools, not staged, not replicated, left exactly as residents abandoned them. Even the absence felt curated by time itself. Eventually, Garnet earned formal national recognition, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, acknowledged not for tragedy, but preservation. Today, visitors can walk the same boardwalks miners once wore smooth, step into cabins where curtains still hang, stand inside the shell of the Wells Hotel, roofless now but upright. The Dahl Saloon operates as a visitor center, interpretive exhibits where whiskey once flowed. A small entry fee helps maintain the site. Volunteers still serve as seasonal docents, caretakers of stories more than structures. 15 to 20,000 visitors come each year, not to see ruins, to see suspension, because Garnet doesn't feel destroyed. It feels paused. Even in winter and when roads close, people still come by snowmobile or skis. Some even rent preserved cabins overnight, sleeping where miners once did, hearing the same wind move through the basin after dark. But preservation raises a quiet question. If a town survives physically, does that mean it's still alive? Or just undecayed? Because Garnet's buildings remain. Its purpose does not. Garnet didn't vanish. It lingered. One cabin at a time, one shuttered window, one empty boardwalk. It exists today not because people returned, but because the mountain never let it go. Its value isn't gold, not even architecture. It's the record. The lived-in details, the chairs in place, the tools still leaning in corners, the schoolhouse with desks empty for decades. It shows what life was like here. Hard, harsh, persistent, not romantic, not legend, just human. Families lived, children played, miners labored, and eventually all left. Buildings remain, memories are archived. Visitors walk through them and feel absence more than presence. Garnet matters because it survived, without intervention, without restoration, without need for spectacle. It teaches what people built and how quickly it can fade, even when carefully preserved. And it waits, waiting for anyone willing to see it. And remember, if you want to follow more stories that linger like this, subscribe. Quietly, coldly, because some places don't shout, they wait.